Quem tem uma empresa sabe quanto tempo é valioso. Por isso, a Apex Brasil apoia empresas brasileiras que querem exportar seus produtos, atrair investimentos estrangeiros ou empreender no exterior. Com a Apex Brasil, as empresas brasileiras têm um apoio estratégico para mandar seus produtos e serviços para fora do país de uma forma inteligente e segura. Com métodos inovadores, parcerias, soluções inteligentes, visão de mercado, conteúdos estratégicos e muita qualificação, a Apex Brasil é referência na promoção de exportações, internacionalização de empresas e atração de investimentos estrangeiros. A agência também atua de forma coordenada com atores públicos e privados em setores estratégicos, tanto para o desenvolvimento da competitividade das empresas quanto para o fortalecimento da economia brasileira. Se é conexão com o mundo de oportunidades no mercado internacional que a sua empresa procura, é o apoio da Apex Brasil que ela precisa. Acesse o mundo. Acesse Apex Brasil.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Paolo Frankel. I'm the head of the Renewable Energy Division at the IEA, and I have the honor and pleasure to be the chair of this important webinar on the Biofuture Policy Blueprint. I will be accompanied in this endeavor by Dr. Heitor Cantarella, who is the Director of Soils and Environmental Resource Center at the Agronomic Institute of Campinas, and member of the FAPES Bioenergy program, Bioenergy. This afternoon, we have a distinguished panel of 4 speakers, which I will introduce later one by one with their introductory input. But please allow me to say just a few introductory remarks to introduce this important webinar. First, it's maybe obvious for this community, but it's always worth reminding. Bioenergy is truly the overlooked giant of renewable energy. A lot of attention on newspapers is very often on solar and wind, on renewable electricity, and we forget that today the majority of renewables is produced by energy because it's the only form of renewables that allows the production of renewable electricity, renewable heat, and fuels for transport. Now, this will also remain in the future, and actually modern sustainable bioenergy will need to significantly increase in long-term sustainable scenarios. Yesterday, I presented the very new net zero emission roadmap of the IEA, but I would like to underline that in all long-term sustainable scenarios from the IEA, but also other scenarios, as for instance presented by the IPCC, in all these scenarios, bioenergy is set to significantly increase. And I would like to emphasize that this is complementary to energy efficiency and electrification. The role of bioenergy is in addition, it is not in substitution. While some of the external commentators sometimes oppose bioenergy to these other sources of renewables, this is not very helpful because we will need all form for renewables in a more sustainable future. Now, to give you just a scale of the challenge, by 2030, we should phase out completely the non-sustainable traditional use of biomass in developing countries, which used in particular indoor for cooking can bring severe health problems. But on the opposite, the use of modern sustainable bioenergy should double in overall, and in some sectors, like in the transport sector, should triple by 2030. Now, as my colleague, Dr. Adam Brown, will show you in a very few minutes, the current trends are not heading there. Bioenergy use is increasing, but not fast enough. Now, having said so, the trends can be very different from regions to regions, from country to country. Why? What are the main drivers? What are the main barriers? What are the best policies that lead to investment and ultimately to deployment? Now, this is the objective of the Biofuture Policy Blueprint work, which tries to assess policies to ultimately accelerate the use of bioenergy and the bioeconomy at large. Now, this assessment is done through quantitative and qualitative measures. In business schools, one of the first things that you learn is what is not measured cannot be managed. Now, and the evaluation is on policies should be based on facts, on numbers. This is exactly what this exercise has been doing. For instance, to look at policy effectiveness in terms of reaching a certain share of bioenergy on total final consumption in a country, or in terms of cost effectiveness, looking at how much of dollar incentives you have for a certain volume of energy, or the cost of avoided CO2 emissions. Now, another important point is that bioenergy policies have multiple dimensions. Yesterday, in another webinar, very correctly, Michela Morese from the Global Bioenergy Partnership underlined several times that when we speak about sustainability, we never have to forget all the dimensions, not just the environmental, but also the social one and the economic. Precisely here, we have multiple dimensions of policies on bioenergy that needs to be taken into account, and you will see the results in a few minutes. So the goal is to assess, to compare, to learn from each other, and then ultimately how to improve and accelerate deployment. And this is the main goal of the Biofuture platform exercise. I would like to conclude my very short remarks before giving the floor to my former colleague, Dr. Adam Brown. This is work in progress. What we are showing here today are some intermediate results and some prospects for the future next steps. Now, with that, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Adam Brown. He is a former colleague of the IEA. He is a very distinguished expert in the renewable energy and bioenergy field. I would like to give you, Adam, the floor and guide us through the methodology and to the first steps and results of the Biofuture Policy Blueprint. Before then, we go into more details of the different countries. Adam, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paolo. Thank you for that introduction. And it's a pleasure to be participating in this webinar this afternoon. I've been working to develop this policy blueprint. It's based a little bit on some work I did when I was at the IEA, and I've been elaborating this, particularly with help from Andrea Rossi, who works with us in this Biofuture platform facilitation team. What I will try to do is, first of all, explain the approach that we've taken to developing the policy blueprint, just show where we've got to so far, give you a flavor of some of the results that we have from applying the blueprint in the biofuels for transport sector in 3 countries, and then just give a little bit of a review of what I think we've done so far, and then what the next steps are. So if I can have the next slide, please. Now this just follows on from the comments that Paolo has just made. You see here on this graph the trend in the total global production of biofuels running up to 2020, when there was a drop because of the COVID problems, and then the IEA's forecast for the next 5 years as in their Renewables 2020 scenario. And on the right-hand side, you can see the global level of biofuels that is embodied in transport, which is embodied in the IEA's Sustainable Development Scenario. That's a scenario consistent with a 1.5 degree temperature rise, so a little bit more conservative than what Paolo showed yesterday, but I don't think the numbers are all that different in that scenario for 2030. Now you can see that if we carry on at the current rate, well, there will be some growth in bioenergy in transport, but nothing like enough to get to this tripling we need by 2030. So not only do we need to accelerate, but we can't wait 5 years and then decide to accelerate. We need to get on with things pretty quickly. And so the rationale for this Biofuture Policy Blueprint work is that unless we have more ambitious and more effective policies, then we're not going to get anywhere near the levels which we're aspiring to. Next slide, please. So how are we setting about developing this blueprint? The aim is to help us accelerate the sustainable bioeconomy by providing practical guidance and to policymakers so they can have better and more effective policies. Our aim is to develop an approach which we can apply to all the different elements of the bioeconomy, but in the initial phase, we're going to concentrate on biofuels for transport because there's more track record there, and it's something we can get our teeth into earlier on. We wanted to root this not in theoretical evaluations of what makes good policy or not, but in what actually is happening in countries. So we've developed an evaluation methodology, which means we can go and look at what's happening in a particular country. We can evaluate the country policy, and then out of that we can pull some guidance, including some best policy principles. What are the elements which a good policy portfolio should contain? Some examples of good practice case studies and some lessons learned. I don't think we'll ever get to the point where we say this is the only way to promote, to have a policy portfolio promoting bioenergy, because every country will have its own, will need to put its own flavour on. Next slide, please. So where have we got to so far? So we drafted a methodology. We worked with 3 countries who kindly volunteered for this mission, Brazil, US, and Netherlands. We did a first go at reviewing the policies, and that led to some feedback into the methodology and so on. We iterated a little bit around that till we had something that we felt worked. We then subjected what we'd done to review by a number of the other international agencies working in this area, to IRENA, to people at the IEA, to IEA Bioenergy, and also to GBEP and FAO, and got their feedback on what we've done, and again revised a little bit what the approach was. So now we have a methodology which we think works. We have the reviews of the policies in the 3 countries in what we've called a policy profile. And then from that, we've drawn some initial results and also started to pull out a number of good practice policy examples. I'd just like to say thanks to the 3 countries who've helped us with this. They've been very patient in answering my crazy questions about what's going on in their country, so I'm very grateful to Jim Spaeth and Alicia Lindauer in the US, to Kees, who's on the call today, and Elke van Thul in Netherlands, and to Angela Oliveira da Costa and all her team at EPA and some people at ANP in Brazil. So thanks to all of you for your patience with me. Next slide, please. Now, the heart of this evaluation is the country profiles. We've developed a sort of standard content for these. First of all, we look at the overall context in which the policy is operating in the country, at the energy trends, the policy drivers, at the overall role of bioenergy in the energy economy. We then look quite carefully at what's actually happening in terms of the market, both in terms of production, but particularly in terms of biofuel use, and also at the impacts that that is having in terms of greenhouse gas savings, employment, other things. We then do quite a detailed description of the policies or the main policies which are in place. And then we use all that information to do an analysis, first of all, to look, as Paolo said, against some quantitative indicators, deployment indicators, which I'll describe in a minute, and then also to do a more qualitative analysis of the policy portfolio to see to what extent it covers what we think are the essential elements needed in such a portfolio. Next slide, please. So if we look at first of all, at these quantitative indicators, these status indicators, the things we've been looking at are what proportion of total final energy consumption is met by energy as a whole? How much does bioenergy contribute to final energy consumption in the transport sector? How is the use of biofuels in transport growing? Is it growing? And if it is it growing as quickly as we'd like it to be in line with the IEA SDS scenario? And for each country or region in that, there is a disaggregated number for each of the big countries and each region. Then we've looked at some of the benefits. What are the greenhouse gas savings based on the country's own estimates for the use of biofuels in transport, in terms of how much greenhouse gases are being saved for every unit of biofuels used, every energy unit of biofuels used. Is there an assessment of how many jobs associated with biofuels production or use? And then we've looked at what is the total financial support being provided for each unit of fuel used. So for each petajoule of biofuels being used, how many dollars is being provided to make this work? And then we've then calculated from that and the greenhouse gas savings, where we can, how much each unit of greenhouse gas saving is costing in terms of these financial support costs. Next slide, please. Now, when we look then at the qualitative analysis, we've identified 6, what I've called here, critical policy issues. These we think are the 6 things which absolutely need to be covered in one way or another in the policy portfolio. There are, of course, many, many other things you can put into this, but we've tried to hone in on 6 what we think are essential things. And this forms the core, if you like, of the policy blueprint. First, we think it's very important that biofuels are treated seriously, that are really given strategic priority in the country's energy planning, and that there are targets for deployment which are ambitious and, if possible, in line with the IEA SDS. I think if a country doesn't set out to tackle biofuels and bioenergy as a whole seriously, it won't do it, because it needs a lot of interministerial cooperation and things, and it really needs to be given a national priority to make this work. Secondly, there's a need for policy clarity and certainty. This is always what industry says they most need from policies. They need to be able to see what the policy framework and how the policy framework can help over an extended period. So do the policies provide a secure long-term basis to promote deployment and investment in biofuels? Do biofuels provide ready market access for biofuels? Because there are many barriers which can get in the way of that, and that's something which is absolutely essential. Are there sufficient financial incentives to make biofuels production and use viable? Critically, are there proper measures in place which make sure that the bioenergy that's used is sustainable in terms of providing significant greenhouse gas savings, but also promoting other aspects of sustainable development, stopping unhelpful impacts, but also promoting positive social, environmental, and economic impacts? And then lastly, is there support for innovation? If we're going to get up to the levels in 2030, but particularly if we're going for biofuels to fulfill its longer term roles in the future energy scenarios, we will need new fuels. We'll need fuels getting into new market sectors like aviation, for example. So is there support for development, but also for commercialization of new fuels and processes? And we think these are the 6 key elements which are needed in a policy portfolio. Next slide, please. So let's look at a few of the results and analyses from what I've done so far. I can't go through everything that we've done because I don't have time, but just a few snapshots. Here's the first one, which is the level of bioenergy in final energy consumption and in transport. So we've compared as a percentage these 2 things for the 3 countries, and you can see, as everybody knows, Brazil is an outstanding example in this globally, with a very high level of bioenergy in final energy consumption overall, compared with the other countries, which are around 5% of overall bioenergy and final energy consumption. That's about the global average, around 5%. And then in transport, again, Brazil is miles ahead of anybody at 25%, the US at 5%, and Netherlands getting towards 7%. Next slide, please. We've looked at these growth profiles, and you can see that in Brazil and in the Netherlands, actually over the last 5 years, biofuels have been growing quite significantly and actually are pretty close to, or in the Netherlands case, actually, if we carried on at that rate of growth, which may be difficult, but nonetheless, would be very close to the levels for 2025 and 2030 in the SDS. In the US, if we'd done this slide for 5 or 10 years before, that would have shown huge growth as the renewable fuel standard got into gear in the US. But in the last few years, actually growth has been relatively low, not much growth at all in the ethanol market, but some growth in the biodiesel and more recently, of course, in the HVO market. But the US will need to accelerate very significantly if it's going to get up to the SDS levels by 2030 and beyond. Next slide, please. We've looked at how much greenhouse gas savings there is per unit of biofuels. We've used the country's estimates of the greenhouse gas savings overall, and then just divided that by how many units of biofuels there were in 2019. It's a bit difficult to make the comparison because, of course, there are some methodological differences between the 3 countries, which make we probably need to delve into this in a bit more detail. But for example, you can see quite a significant difference in this between the US and the Netherlands. And I think this is because in the Netherlands, there's a very high greenhouse gas threshold before you can qualify your biofuels for the support system. And of course, there's also a strong emphasis on residue and waste-based fuels, which means that there is no land use change or indirect land use change factored into the calculations. Next slide, please. Then we've looked at these financial incentives. What we've done is we've taken on the graph on the left-hand side, we've looked at the total support costs as we can identify them per unit of energy. So you see in the US, there's a range between about, I think it's about 2 and 10 US dollars per gigajoule, depending on the fuel. The higher level there is for the biodiesel, the lower level is for the ethanol, which is significantly lower than that in the Netherlands, which is around 12, I think, at the lowest, going up to over 30, depending again on the type of fuel, with the waste-based fuels receiving 2 credits for every energy unit. So there, in some cases, the total support costs get up over $30 a gigajoule. We've also just done the quick calculation to say, well, okay, if we do that in terms of how many tons of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases are saved, then actually that difference narrows quite a bit. And if in the US you look at what's happening in California with a low carbon fuel standard, where there's an additional $200 per ton of carbon involved, then actually in California the financial incentives are significantly higher than in Netherlands, and that perhaps explains why there's such a rush to invest in HVO production and other things in California. Next slide, please. Now we've through looking in detail at the policies in each of the countries, we've been able to pull out some of the good practice policy examples. For example, in Brazil and Netherlands, biofuels is very clearly identified in their long-term energy plans. In terms of policy clarity and certainty, then again, in all 3 countries, then this is provided through blending mandates and blending obligations, which in the case of Netherlands, for example, there's a clear level of the obligation out to 2030. In the US, there's a little less certainty around the levels of the RFS and indeed some of the other incentives are not so clear. Next one, please. In terms of market access, then countries have applied different types of policies. We have mandatory high blending levels in Brazil, with you basically can't buy gasoline without 27% of ethanol in it, whereas in the other 2 countries, it's the annual obligation or the renewable fuel standard, which secure market access there. Brazil uses tax and duty differentials principally to provide financial support, with Renova Bio just getting into gear, whereas in the Netherlands and USA, it's principally provided by the value of the certificates. Next slide, please. Each country has sustainability governance. It's actually quite hard to compare and contrast these because the very different approach and different concerns about sustainability in each of the 3 countries, and that's something I think we'll need to do some more work in, and that fits in with the discussion we had yesterday on sustainability. And then lastly, in terms of innovation, each country has some support for R&D. The US, I think, is particularly strong in this area, with an annual budget for RD&D of around $250 million a year, as well as other tools to promote commercialization of new fuels, including a risk loan scheme for novel bioenergy projects. Next slide, please. Now we're able to then look at the policies in each country, and through these policy spiders, see to what extent they tick the boxes, if you like, for our 6 policy priorities. And you see that Brazil is, as you'd imagine, pretty strong. It's not as perhaps giving as much priority to innovation for new fuels like things for aviation as some other countries. Netherlands also has a very strong overall portfolio, not very strong on promoting higher level blending in transport, for example. The US hasn't had a very strong strategic approach to bioenergy in its national planning. We know, of course, that the new administration is giving much greater emphasis on sustainable energy and climate issues and so on and so forth. So maybe that will change. But it's just to show that we can highlight areas of strength and also maybe areas where a little bit more could be done. So very quickly then, just to next slide, please. So what do we think we've got to so far? We think we have a useful and a practical methodology. It's based largely on relatively easily found information. We can do a detailed and critical analysis of a country's biofuels policies on a common basis and in dialogue with the policymakers, and we can identify best practice policy examples. We think there's probably need to do some more work on the interpretation of some of the indicators we've used, for example, by analysing future support costs. And I think we particularly need to think in more depth about the sustainability best practice evaluation. The work we've done so far really highlights some different approaches in the different countries, different priorities, and I think there are links there to the wider Biofuture platform work on sustainability. And my last slide, I think. So what are the next steps? We'd be grateful for more feedback through this exercise and so on. We're constantly trying to evolve and improve what we're doing. We will make available a number of documents from the work we've done so far, the methodology statement, the policy profiles for the 3 countries and these preliminary results, and what we see as the best practice policy principles and the examples we've managed to take from the 3 countries we've done so far. It would be good to extend the work we've done on transport biofuels with some more countries to get some more dots on our map. We need to refine our approach to the support costs and the sustainability policy analysis, as I've said. We will then try and adapt the methodology, first of all, to look at bioenergy for heat and electricity. Methodology to the wider bioeconomy. So the documentation from what we've done so far will be available shortly, in a couple of weeks' time, I think, and then we'll work in the year that comes on these other elements. So sorry that was a bit rushed, but there's quite a lot of details in what we've done, and I hope I've given you a flavour for where we are so far. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adam, for your comprehensive presentation and for giving us a number of examples from the countries. We will hear more detail in a minute. And also to remind us about the different dimensions of the policies. It's not just about economic incentives, it's a much more complex environment, which is crucial for the success or for the failures of policies on bioenergy. Now, before I give the floor to the next speaker, I would like to remind any attendee to write their questions in the Q&A session, and also to please fill in the poll in the platform that you have. It's with a number of questions of what you expect from this policy blueprint exercise. With that, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Eloisa Esteves, who is Director of Oil, Gas and Biofuel Studies at the Energy Research Office in Brazil, who we all know is the mind of the policies of the countries. Renato and the ministry colleagues will apologize, will bear me. Eloisa, the floor is yours, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo, for the kind introduction, and thank you all for the invitation. I just hope you haven't, created me a problem with Renato. I will present about Brazilian experience on the policy blueprint and overall our experience in collaborating in several ways regarding biofuels. Next slide, please. I'd like to thank you all, congratulating for the excellent event we're having. Yesterday panels were fantastic, and they have provided some insights that we will readdress in this panel, probably. And I would like to thank all my colleagues. The experience of the United States and Netherlands are also very interesting and have provided opportunities for Brazil to learn as well. This is a brief summary of my presentation. I'll start with our participation in the Biofuture platform. We've been actively participating in the effort since 2016. And also, I will present Brazil biofuels policies. Again, it has been several panels have talked about that, so I'll try to present a new perspective. We've talked about the main drivers, main characteristics, and best policies features, and that's what we're talking about. As Mr. Brown has just pointed out, we are trying to access policies in order to identify how to accelerate them, how Brazil can learn and share experience. And in order to do that, we have to take into account multiple experiences. Next slide, please. Well, as this slide shows, Brazil has participating in IEA programs for quite a few time now. Brazil is a champion of bioenergy. I do not have to tell, but I will do it anyway. That biofuel policies in Brazil have a long history, and we strongly believe in the potential of biofuels, both to the energy sector of the world in general, but specifically for Brazil. And it's an active and very important part of the Brazilian strategic energy planning. We've joined the Mission Innovation in 2016. We have participated in the Biofuture platform since 2017, and I have pointed out some other initiatives that have several synergies with the Biofuture platform, the Task 39, Advanced Motor Fuels TCP, the Bioeconomy Policy Blueprint, and the Energy Efficiency Task Forces. And it's interesting because yesterday, Dr. Maria Micaela from the Global Bioenergy Partnership, when she talked in a panel yesterday, and she has recognized the Brazilian importance in that alliance since 2005 as well. Originally, Brazil was the chair of the first meeting in Rome, and I would just like to stress that we are always available to collaborate in all the initiatives regarding bioenergy. Next slide, please. Well, our main results that since the Biofuture platform started, the partnership has been constructive, collaborative, and very fruitful. I hope for other countries as well, but definitely for Brazil. And among the key results of this joint work, I would like to point out some reports. The survey on biofuels byproducts that we've collaborated in 2017-18, the report summary, and the Task 39 report that we finished last year, the energy efficiency report that we have participating in the benchmarking chapter since 2018. And specifically when we talk about transportation, there's the technology collaboration program in advanced motor fuels, and we have participated in several documents on 2019 and 20. And what we have learned is that through the knowledge exchange, learning and sharing knowledge in the most diverse ways, we have been trying to contribute to bioenergy and bioeconomy national policies around the world. Mr. Paolo Frank from the IEA, and that has worked with us, and Mr. Brown, several initiatives. Yesterday talked about the bioenergy and carbon capture storage. It's a new strategy, but I also believe that Brazil has a total potential to be part of this initiative as well. We have also studies in carbon capture storage, and all those programs, they are interconnected. I would like to point out that we cannot look at the problem in specific box. We have to approach, as Mr. Brown said, in the rhythm, the speed we are going now will not reach our goal when we need to reach. We might be late, so we have to accelerate our efforts, and we propose to do that, looking at the problem each way more in a more integrated, collaborative way. Next slide, please. Our key learnings from our collaboration, I would like to point out 4 key learnings. The first and more important one is that union makes us stronger. The idea of the Biofuture Policy Initiative is to learn from each other, to access policies and see how can we take the good experience and make the world a better one, design better policies for all the world. So we have noticed that environmental policies and initiatives in bioenergy, but policies in general, they have stronger impacts when countries connect, debate, and collaborate. It's a joint effort. We have learned the importance of a shared view. The broad and deep technical lessons from this program, they come from it's a very rich it's a very rich material because it comes from diverse countries, diverse experience. So the second point I would like to make is the importance of a shared view. The third point, I don't have to make it, but it's important to always stress out, sustainability is the key. We are not choosing technologies, but we have to aim towards sustainable, low carbon, modern alternatives to fossil fuels. They are essential for a global, sustainable, environmental, economic, and financial future. So it's important to stress out that we are not only it's not only about biofuels or bioenergy, or it's about a better future, a sustainable future. And that's the end goal. Fourth key learning is that although Brazil is a renewables leader, and the next slide I will make that point again, we still have a lot to learn. We have great advances. Brazil is now where most countries aim to be by 2030, 2015, but we still need to keep track of our growth needs and carbon emission levels. On average, the global average is 14 of renewable energy in the primary energy supply. Brazil is already in 46% renewable, 25% renewable on the transportation sector. And I would like to point out that by 2030, although the total energy mix in Brazil will grow, we will still enhance in the renewability of our matrix. Yesterday, Professor Brito Cruz from Unicamp showed those same numbers in the open ceremony, and I would like to point out that Brazil's results do not give us it's not an advantage if we do not keep going, keep moving forward. Next slide, please. But how did we reach it? It's clear in the document. Brazil's ethanol policy, it's quite old, actually. It dates back to the 1970s. But I'm showing just the last decade evolution. You will see that anhydrous ethanol level, it's the mandate to mix with gasoline, around 25%, sometimes a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more. Nowadays it's 27%, but the law allows the Brazilian government to a certain flexibility in fixating that mandates. And it's a very successful policy. You would see that the biodiesel mandate has been growing. It started at 2% back in 2005, and it's we have met several steps. Now we are at 13% by 2020, and the goal is to reach 15% mandate in 2 years. Next slide, please. But even before the mandate, as Mr. Brown has pointed out in his presentation, Brazil has a fiscal incentive specifically designed for biofuels. The federal government has preferential treatment for ethanol compared to gasoline in different mechanisms. And there are also different rates for the IVA, or equivalent of IVA, the tax on the circulation of goods and services in Brazil. It depends on the state. It's figure 7. So we have incentives on federal and state levels, and those incentives have played an important part in advancing on the biofuels policies in Brazil, while considering, in our point of view, the huge effort Brazil would have to make if adopted a strategy based on direct financial incentives. So we are very, very satisfied with the results of a tax policy. Next slide, please. We have the last program is in RenovaBio. It has been mentioned in this panel, other panels, and actually in the IEA report of the 2050 roadmap to net zero carbon world. And it's a key part of the Brazilian strategy now. And as we say in Brazil, it came to stay. It's not going away. But on the other hand, the RenovaBio faced a major challenge right in its first year. The policy was created some years ago, but the first year of the implementation of the policy was 2020, and the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic have had at some point created doubts of the sustainability of the policy. But as we like to say, if RenovaBio survived its first year, and it was a very challenging year, it's a very good result. At the end of the year, distributors met 97.6% of the target. But I would like to point out that there was in the middle of 2020, the Brazilian government reduced the target due to the pandemic. The RenovaBio policy, it's actually inspired in the low carbon fuel standards from California with our spice. but it was inspired and then adapted to the Brazilian experience. The idea is to stimulate carbon footprint reduction and investments in process efficiencies. 2019, which was the year where we finished all the regulatory and legal aspects of the RenovaBio, was a very challenging year. And 2020 was a year of learning, both to the private and public agents. But now the policy is in full operation, and as far we are very confident that it's an adequate instrument to guarantee the sustainability and predictability of the renewability of our transport matrix, and it seems to give good and correct incentives for investments in bioenergy. Next slide, please. How it does that? It incentivizes a reduction of transport emissions through a long-term target. It's a 10-year period targets that are break down in annual targets, and the annual targets are assigned for individual fuel distributors. They are the obligated parts. They have to acquire the carbon certificates, the CBIOs, and producers they get to commercialize carbon certificates. But the value of the carbon certificate is established by the trading the stock market. The graph you are seeing shows the evolution through 2020. So you see that the initial pattern of trading CBIOs right in the beginning of the graph, it was very low up to July 2020. In October, we've reached 8 million, almost 8 million CBIOs traded. In the end of the year, we can see that there was actually more CBIOs than the market had to acquire. And one point that we need to keep following up is the price of the CBIO, because it has to provide, or the idea is that it provides sufficient incentives to stimulate investments in new technologies and fuels. EPE, the Energy Research Office, we estimate that this policy can expand current ethanol production to 48 billion liters and by 2030, and biodiesel will reach at least 11 billion liters by 2030. Next slide, please. Those are my closing remarks. I hope I've met my time. I would like to point out 4 remarks as a closing remarks. The first one is that Brazil still has a significant repressed energy demand, both in the transportation sector and in the energy sector in general. Brazil by 2050 will need to at least double its energy consumption. Even considering energy efficiency programs and strategies, we still need a lot of energy to meet our developing goals, to guarantee economic and sustainability for our society. So that's the first one. It will be an extreme challenge to keep renewability while enhancing total energy supply, and that's why we cannot think or feel that our work is done. That because we have a very good renewable matrix now, we won't have to make efforts in the future. We still have to make a lot of effort. And the 10-year plan that EPE published in the beginning of the year, by the 2030 energy plan, shows that how we can do that, and in the middle term we will meet our energy demand, actually enhancing renewability. But that's a challenge. We have to keep that in mind. Brazil is a leader in the use of renewables in the energy matrix, but we still have to pay attention, not only when we talk about transportation sector, not only to the like say the roads and the cars we use every day. I forgot the technical name. But also, I would like to point out, as Mr. Brown has pointed out, that we have to pay attention to shipping and aviation, and the importance that advancing in decarbonization, shipping and aviation will have from now on. Yesterday, I saw a very interesting panel by Dr. Gerhard Ostmeyer. I hope I said his name right, in the Biomass Quantification Sustainability Governance panel. And he talked about not only the challenges that we have when we think in the broad transportation sector, but also in the role that each stakeholder has, not only governments, but private stakeholders as well. He gave an example that I took note, that the Maersk, the company, shipping company, now is making demands for all their ships that all of them will have to be carbon neutral from now on. So that's countries, when designing, that's something that countries, when designing their policies, we have to pay attention. The last one is the importance of knowledge exchange, efficient exchange, interchangeability. I don't know, switch. We have to share experience and learn how each country can help in one way or another, because we can all help each other. And I hope that the Brazilian experience and contribution in the Biofuture Policy Blueprint can be used as a useful experience for other countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eloisa. Thank you also for reminding us the perspective on an emerging economy where the challenge is to increase renewable faster than an increasing demand, which is something that sometimes we tend to forget in Europe. Speaking of which, we cross the ocean and we go to the Netherlands, and the floor is now with Mr. Kees Quant, senior official at the Netherlands Enterprise Agency, Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate. I would like to ask you, Kees, and also then Mr. Wang, to stick you for your time. We would like to have enough time for a Q&A. I will then ask all of you challenging questions. But Kees, now the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Yeah, so the first slide, please. I'll try to stick to the time. So indeed, this is all about learning about policies, learning from each other. And we all have a big challenge ahead of us. And so for the Netherlands, climate change is a very important challenge that we have ahead of us. As you all know, our big airport, Schiphol, is 6 meters below sea level. We have dikes, they can still stop the water, but if something happens, that we will not have no longer an airport. So something needs to be done. Next slide. So we are small, it's a densely populated country, but we have made a very ambitious goal of more than 50% greenhouse gas reduction in 2030. And also something we have to take into account is that last year we have formulated a new biomass policy. And what we see is that biomass has value, and we have to create more value out of the biomass. So for that reason, we think in the long term it's a pity to burn just the biomass. So we want to phase out biomass for power and heating and rather use the alternatives. But we need a transition in the transport sector, so that's where we need the biofuels. But we want to grow, and that's the new thing we want to do with the biomass, is specifically to look in biomass for chemicals and products, so that we can replace the fossil resources there. Next slide. So, next slide. we'll skip this one because of time. It's so there is this CO2 trajectory of where we are at this moment. So you can see between 1990 and now, we have had a reduction of 11% in CO2 emissions. This is really an achievement that we have done, but there were also a lot of fluor keeping gases in it. And now, over the next years, we will really have to accelerate in order to get to this 250. And we will have to do the difficult part, to take the CO2 out of our economy. Next slide, please. And for that reason, we have made a climate agreement. So an agreement with all the different sectors, because each one has to contribute. It's industry. We will stop coal-fired power plants by 2030, maybe even earlier. There's a lot of political discussion there. So the request from the IEA in this latest net zero scenario, I think it's very, very timely. We want to stop with coal. We will have much more wind and solar energy. For example, for wind on sea, we are now at 1 gigawatt, and we aim for 12 gigawatt in the year 2030. But that will still not be enough. We will need much more, especially when we want to have more electrification, for example, of heat supply, or even hydrogen, and store that. So it's a huge demand for electricity. And biomass for transport fuels and chemicals, that is the crucial other thing that needs to be supported and be brought into our energy system. The next slide. So this is a kind of graph where you can see how all the different sectors contribute, and you can see really the electricity sector, CO2 emissions can go down a lot. That's because we close the coal-fired power plants. But also in mobility and industry, we also want to see an enormous reduction. So this is a major effort that has to happen in these 10 years that we have ahead of us. Next slide, please. So what did we achieve so far? So at this moment, we are at about 8% renewable energy. In the year 2019, it was 8% renewable energy. More than half of it was from biomass, but you can see that from now on, wind and solar will grow faster than biomass, though biomass is still growing. The next slide, please. You can see here how biomass has contributed over the last decades. We don't have that enormous big figures as Brazil has, but still we have a lot of small areas where we have the production of renewable energy from biomass. It's from heating, but also energy from waste. So we have all our incineration plants, they recover heat for power, but also for heating. We have improved amount of biogas heating, but also you can see that between 2005 and 2015, we had a lot of coal-firing. And also at this moment, we have 25 petajoule of coal-firing in our system to replace fossil fuels. And actually, since the year 2007, we started with biofuels. Why did we start with biofuels? Because we saw that we needed something to reduce CO2 emissions from the transport sector. So biofuels was the only thing. Also, the European Union started with it. So since then, it has become a more and more larger part of our portfolio. I will explain more in detail what is happening there. Next slide. So this is our, let's say, transport system, the mobility. So transport energy, you can see it is more than half of it is diesel, that's the gray part, gasoline, the yellow part, and then there are some other fuels that are used. And the orange line gives the percentage of bioenergy, going from 2% in 2010 to this 5% in 2018, and now we are already above 10%. And the biofuels on the right picture, you can see it's ethanol to replace the gasoline. The black part, it is the FAME, produced mainly from waste oils. But you can also see that since 2018 we have a little bit of biogas, biomethane fed into the grid, and also an increasing amount of HVO that is fed into the grid, fed into our transport system. Next slide, please. So this is how it works. In the Netherlands, we put an obligation on the distributors of transport fuels. So it's an obligation on the Exxons, the Shells, and so on, who distribute the fuels. They have a permit to distribute the fuel, but in this permit, we ask them to a certain percentage of renewable fuel, and then it's rather up to them how to feed that. They can buy it wherever they want to buy it. They can also import these fuels. It doesn't have to be produced in the Netherlands. And then you can also see that on the right-hand side, and since 2018, we have also, let's say, put a limit on the so-called conventional biofuels, so from sugars, and we also have made a sub-target for advanced biofuels, and which is growing. Actually, the biofuel production, it's not obligatory to produce this in the Netherlands, but a large part of the biofuels is produced in Rotterdam Harbor. So that's where, even for other parts of Europe, we produce the biofuels. What is also interesting, and that's written on the right-hand side, that is the so-called opt-in. So, so the distributors, they have to show, for example, in the year 2019, that they have a blending of 12.5%. So that can be a blending in their own fuel, but they can also sell. They have to show this through certificates, and these certificates, they can also sell these certificates to, for example, the marine sector or to the aviation sector. So, for example, when Sky Energy is using aviation fuels in the aviation sector, they have a certificate that they have used this fuel in their fuels, and so that same let's say certificate also counts with this 12.5%. So as a let's say as a distributor, you have the choice to use bioethanol and buy that at a certain price, or buy this certificate at a certain price. So always, let's say, the market will look for the cheapest solution. So that's how we use these opt-ins for sustainable marine and aviation fuels. It is not every year. So we had last year, we had the sustainable marine included, but this year it's not included as an opt-in option. But we still have the aviation fuels, and we foresee that that will take place till the year 2030. Next slide, please. So here you can see how we will increase the market over the next years, because we want to go for, let's say, from the present 14% to 27% of blending in the year 2030, so that we can really meet the targets that we have, and we will have certain limits and sub-targets for the different fuels within this scheme. And at the same moment, and this is then in addition and not as an opt-in option, also have the 14% sustainable aviation fuels in the year 2030. So next slide, please. This is also the graph that has been shown previously by Adam Brown, where he compared what we have achieved, but also what we are aiming for through this obligation in the year 2030. And you can see that we can meet the SDS targets. Next slide, please. So for aviation fuels, we have set up an action program. And so basically, we want to start production in our own country. So that's with 200,000 tons of sustainable fuels, HEFA, but in the year 2024. And after that, we will then also stop with the opt-in option, and we are looking for an obligation for the aviation sector itself. This is something we would like to do, of course, in collaboration with other countries and not just for the Netherlands. So this is really something that is under development, and also the production will then be increased to more HEFA, but we will also look for new fuels. So let's say e-fuels. Let's see how that can be produced. so that we could achieve a 14% reduction of greenhouse gases in aviation with sustainable aviation fuels by the year 2030. So next slide, please. So sustainability is quite crucial, as was already mentioned. Here in the Netherlands, we have quite a strict sustainability scheme, specifically for coal-firing biomass in our coal-fired power plants. So this was really, it is possible, but there's a lot of discussion. So we have a very strict certification scheme. And for the biofuels, we follow the Renewable Energy Directive certification scheme, and we implement that. But we are also now trying to look beyond that in a national integrated sustainability framework, where we will also look for sustainability for the bioresources that are used for chemicals and materials. So that's really something new where we will look at, and that will really require some work to get there. Next slide, please. So innovation, we had a support system for, let's say, for this, and actually also this year we have quite some interesting calls to make our transport system more sustainable, to get aviation and marine fuels included. So by next month we will have a call specifically for advanced aviation and marine biofuels. But there is also a big call for the mobility sector as a whole with 150 million euro. We will also support our biofuels and e-fuels in the transport sector so that we get more market introduction. And also, not on this scheme, actually, we have at this moment a joint call between NWO, our research organization, and FAPESP, the Brazilian research organization, on, let's say, the sustainable production of biomass, bioresources for the bio-based economy, and to look at that in an integral way, as it was also just mentioned by the previous speaker. So that could lead to an interesting collaboration also between Brazil and the Netherlands on, through innovation, improving the sustainability of the bioresources and also enlarge the possibilities in the market. Next slide, please. So this is then the evaluation that was carried out by Adam Brown, and that was quite interesting to see. Yes, where we are going, and well, in 2030 we have this 24% biofuels, yes, in 2030, and the 14% in the aviation. Through this annual obligation levels, but also certification of sustainability, I think that really gives a policy clarity, this annual obligation. This opt-in for marine and aviation that we have, it is possible, it's not always implemented, but it is a possibility to realize this. And we have, of course, through this support, through these certificates, and that's between 10 and 15 euro per gigajoule, as it was shown before. So this is not a governmental support, but it is a support by those people who drive a car and have to buy a petrol. They just pay a little bit more because our distributors have to buy these certificates. Sustainability was mentioned already, and we try to support wastes as a source, so double counting. And as I mentioned, we will come to an integral sustainability scheme for all bioresource applications and do more innovation specifically for the aviation and marine sector. Next slide, please. So to conclude, and I think I have met my time limit, it will be a major challenge, and it's as it was presented also yesterday by Paulo Franco, this net zero, let's say, strategy is something we have to do. We all have to work on this, and all options have to be used, otherwise we will not get there. So it's energy conservation, and all the renewables are crucial, including solar, including wind, but also the bioresources as part of that. And at this moment, we still see it is very crucial for the transport sector to get it started. And yesterday we also had our session on, let's say, biofuels versus electrification. And there you can also see that we will need all these options, because just electricity is not enough for the transport sector. And also in the long run, aviation and marine fuels will be needed, so that is also crucial. But we also think that, let's say, for chemicals and materials, so not the energy sector, bioresources can also play an important role, and we think that should have the priority. But we still have to develop a lot of technologies to make that possible. And of course, indeed, sustainable biomass, we have to create more trust in that. And we think that with the RED II criteria that will be implemented in Europe, when we follow that, we can get there and we can convince the public, but specifically also our politicians, that this is also a sustainable way forward. Thank you for your attention. Next slide, yes.
Thank you very much, Kees, for this very comprehensive presentation, and also for showing how holistic the policy approach of the Netherlands is, not looking at the transport sector alone, but the whole energy use and actually the broader bioeconomy. I will return to that. Now, I give now the floor to our last speaker, Dr. Michael Wang, who is the director of the Systems Assessment Center, Director of Energy Systems Division, at the Argonne National Laboratory, USA. Dr. Wang, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Pauno, and thank you for the opportunity. So yeah, let me wait for the slide up. Okay, so yeah, Dr. Brown already presented the US case study in the evaluation. So what I do is I'm going to supplement additional information to what he's already presented. Next slide. So in the US, as many of us know, we have several major biofuel production options. And here I summarize the major ones, which are highlighted in red, as you see. So of course, as we all know, core ethanol is the major production. Soybean-based biodiesel or FAME is another major production pathway. The most recently, in the last several years, the so-called renewable diesel or HVO has become a significant pathway. And for HVO, we have somewhat diversified feedstock supplies, soybean oil, used cooking oil, and animal fat, among other feedstocks. Lastly, the so-called renewable natural gas or biomethane production from different waste streams has become significant production options. Next. And Dr. Brown already summarized the US renewable fuel standard. So here is a snapshot of what's in the RFS in the federal government regulation. So the chart above is what's in the law, the volumetric target put in the renewable fuel standard law. And the table below is what the Environment Protection Agency every year develop the target based on what's in the law. So as you see above in the chart, the so-called cellulosic biofuel group, or the D3 group, the blue bars, had a very aggressive target. But if you see the bottom in the table, the cellulosic biofuel group did not meet the target by a huge margin. The other groups, the other three groups, by and large, meet the target, or in some cases even exceed the target. So that's at the federal level the situation. Next slide. So we talk about the price of the so-called renewable identification number, because RFS, as you saw in the previous slide, is volumetric based with a minimum greenhouse gas reduction threshold. So it is volumetric based. So EPA issues the so-called RIN for each of the four groups. And let the slide show you the supply and the demand of each four groups. And that's reflect in the price of RIN in the trading market. So as you can imagine, the D6 market, that's red and that's corn ethanol. This market is somewhat saturated, so the price is very low, versus D3, that's cellulosic biofuel group, and the supply is much smaller than the potential demand, so the price is high. And most in the last several years, the so-called renewable natural gas production was announced in D3. So in fact, the majority of the volume in D3, in fact, it is from RNG. Next. So that's a snapshot of RFS at national level. At the same time, Dr. Brown summarized at the state level, we have biofuel regulations in place. The most important one, as we all know, is the California Lower Carbon Fuel Standard, the so-called LCFS. And the LCFS started in 2010 and now extended to 2030 with the carbon intensity reduction of 20% versus the 2010 California carbon intensity for all the transportation fuels together. And relative to RFS, your LCFS is carbon intensity based. So in a way, it's performance based standards on greenhouse gas reductions. Besides California, there are some other states has similar program. For example, the state of Oregon has the program very much similar to LCFS. Most recently, the state of Washington adopted a program very similar to LCFS. There are some discussions in some other states, such as the Northeast state and the Upper Midwest state. Now, contemplate the greenhouse gas based performance standards similar to LCFS. So we see some trend that state start to adopt GHG based standards. At the same time, there are some evaluation for potential national LCFS program based on GHG reductions. Next. And in California, this shows the fuel volume under the LCFS. So California's biofuel volume has increased significantly from 2011 up to 2019, and even last year continue to increase. And we anticipate this will going on through 2030 because LCFS now is extended to 2030. And noticeably, the ethanol volume has been stabilized at level. There are some factors for this, and we all know E10, 10% of ethanol blended in gasoline. That's the situation up to last year. Starting last year, now we're on to blend ethanol to E15. So that will give some opportunity for potential ethanol growth. But noticeably, the growth has been in the so-called renewable diesel, or HVO, in last several years, the green bar. And this is because the diesel fuels market is still very much there, and renewable diesel can be used in diesel engine. So this has been the significant growth. The so-called biomethane or RNG has seen some significant growth too, nationwide and in California. Next slide. So this slide summarizes the carbon intensity of several major biofuel pathways, as you saw in the previous slide. And from top to bottom, we see renewable diesel, biodiesel, and the next large group is ethanol. So these are the three major groups. And the dot in the range represent the average. So you see a large variation for each pathway, as this is the base of the individual approved by the state of California. But later on, I'm going to present some result to you. If we look at the trend from 2011 to up to now, and we see the downtrend. Next. So the California's market has strong design for carbon reduction, and because of that, the price for CO2 reduction has been the most significant market, even globally. So as you see on this chart, the red lines, the price has been around $200 per ton of CO2 for all the biofuels, depending on the CIs of specific biofuels. So $200 per ton of CO2, and as we all know globally, that's significant. And that, in fact, induced significant investment in biofuel plant with significant GHG reductions. Next. As I mentioned, RNG has been a significant growth area in the last several years. Nationwide, the significant amount of RNG is produced from landfill gas. So basically, people go up to collect landfill gas and upgrade landfill gas to the quantity that power plant can accept and natural gas vehicles can use. So in the last several years, the expansion has been in landfill-based project. But if you look at this pie chart, the new constructions are in animal waste-based project. So in the near future, we anticipate this too will be the significant RNG sources, landfill, and animal waste. Next. So now I'll quickly go through some of our updated LCA results. And many of you know, we at Argonne National Laboratory developed the GREAT model to do LCA for biofuels and other transportation fuels, such as electricity for battery EV applications and hydrogen for fuel cell applications. Grit is used by California for LCFS and by Oregon for its own clean fuel program. And IKEA now use a Grit version for sustainable aviation fuel pathway CI evaluation. Next. So last year we did the so-called retrospective analysis of U.S. corn ethanol carbon intensity. Next slide. Through 2005 to 2019. So our desire was, so we know RFS has been in place since 2007, and LCFS has been in place since 2010, and we know the industry has grown significantly at corn ethanol with 15 billion gallons a year, still the most significant biofuel production in the US. So we want to take a look at what happened in the last 15 years in terms of carbon intensity of corn ethanol. So this slide summarizes the corn farming trend, the yield in bushels per acre. So we see a continual increase in corn yield, and that results in the farming input reduction. So here you see the nitrogen fertilizer use per bushel. Next. And the farming energy use has some reduction, but not as dramatic as nitrogen fertilizer use per bushel. So this is the trend of corn ethanol yield in ethanol plants. So we see some continual increase in ethanol yield per unit of corn used, and of course that results in some reduction in energy use per gallon of ethanol produced, as you see. Next. So with the two major areas with significant improvement over 15 years, we use Grit to analyze the carbon intensity change for corn ethanol in the US. So the chart here summarizes carbon intensity without land use change. So this is the direct greenhouse gas emissions related to direct activities along the corn ethanol supply chain. So we conclude in 2005, the carbon intensity is about 58 grams per megajoule, and that has been reduced to about 45 grams as of now. Next slide. So I said that slides did not include the land use change. Of course, that make you wonder, so what is the land use change result? So this chart summarizes the land use change greenhouse gas result simulated among different studies. Because as we all know, land use change, both direct and indirect land use change together cannot be measured. So we have to use economical models together with the soil models to simulate the potential land use changes. So this chart summarizes from the first study in 2008 up to the most recent studies in this year from GTAP and Global models. These are the two significant models now used by IKEA for land use change, GHG emissions. So we per megajoule to now below 20 grams per megajoule. And by the way, the California Air Resources Board now use 20 grams per megajoule for corn ethanol. And we use our own model, and we conclude the US corn ethanol land use change greenhouse gas emissions may be below 10 grams. Next. So that's a quick summary to supplement what Dr. Brown presented. And in his presentation, he alluded the greenhouse gas reductions in 3 categories. And of course, 3 categories calculate greenhouse gas reductions based on LCA methodology. And we all, even say our system boundaries are somewhat similar, but our methodologies in land use change, in core product credit are different. So, I think some harmonization for Biofuture platform may be needed, so we can have some consistent GHG reduction estimate. So, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Wang, and thank you all for this presentation. We have a number of questions coming from the floor, which to some extent I would like also to combine with my own. And I would like to start precisely from you, Dr. Wang. It's very clear from your presentation that the United States was effective in increasing the efficiency of the yields of the conventional biofuels, and also to include some innovation, although at the same time, you also recognize that the original targets for some kinds of fuels, like cellulosic fuels, were not at all satisfied. I have 2 questions from you. One is coming from the floor. It basically asks, what role do you think this progress in terms of gaining efficiency, if increasing environmental performance, will play for the US administration to maintain the incentives for biofuels? Is this an important policy driver? This is question number 1. My question, which is related and which I deliberately pose a little bit in a provocative way, you showed prices of California system in the range of $200 per ton of CO2 avoided. This is obviously very high. Now, nobody contests that California is a rich country, is a rich state. But how sustainable do you see this in the future? How do you see this progress? Can this progress be does this need to be so expensive, or do you think that we will see innovations coming, but possibly at lower extra prices for consumers? I would appreciate if you could elaborate in just a few minutes. We have roughly half an hour for all our Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I'll address second question first. The California price of $200, that's the highest in the world. But that's price, not cost. So the actual cost for greenhouse gas reductions should be lower because people want to make a profit from their investment. That said, so the question, can we sustain even this price for LCFS? And we need to look at it this way. LCFS is an isolated program for transportation carbon intensity. So it is not an economy-wide trading program. And we know transportation sector is the hardest sector for decarbonization. And other sectors are somewhat easier. So for example, the power sector has more options and less costly technology options to decarbonize. And because transportation sector is hard to decarbonize, and because LCFS is isolated in transportation, so I think that price will be sustaining for LCFS, because 10% reduction in carbon intensity from 2020 to 2030 for the large transportation fuel demand in the state, 10% is a significant target. And with that strong target in place, I think the price is going to sustain there to achieve 10% reduction. And go to first question. The success and the non-success biofuel production options nationwide in the US. And we say core ethanol has continued to improve, and this is something is not well recognized in the US and in the world. And we see the core ethanol industry continue to improve. The new industries coming in, HVO is new, is coming in strong. RNG is new, is coming in strong. The not success programs, as we all know, cellulosic biofuel, as there are some technology difficulties, and people still work, including the U.S. Department of Energy, continue to put R&D effort to overcome the technical challenges there. So your question is whether the new administration will use what we see the greenhouse gas reductions in the broad decarbonization policy design. The work in national labs that were part of the Department of Energy, but were not directly part under the belong to the Department of Energy. So that's national labs at the DOE arrangement is somewhat unique. But with that, I cannot speak on behalf of federal government or the policy development. I can only say from our researchers' point of view is decarbonization in the US as the new administration established net zero carbon for the power sector and net zero carbon for economy. That's going to be a very tall order for the next 20 years, next 30 years. So biofuels will have to continue to improve carbon footprint and to become a part of the solution for the net zero carbon economy. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this. I would like to stay a little bit in this innovation part and go to Europe, to Case. You showed this holistic approach and the objectives of going from road transport to marine and aviation. Now, how realistic do you see that? I remember your first objective for 2024. And then there was a related question from the floor asking, do you see this happening also in other European countries, for instance, driven by more electric vehicles, that we will see a shift from the biofuels used from road to aviation and marine, and how do you think this can be incentivized? So one part of the question is for the Netherlands, but happy if you can add a European flavor to that.
Okay, thank you very much for this question. It is, let's say, first of all, let's focus on the Netherlands. What we do in our country is following the Renewable Energy Directive, and also we will also follow our own national, let's say, approach. What we see at this moment, and well, it might change under the, let's say, the new, let's say, green approach from Europe, but the Renewable Energy Directive is only focusing on energy. So for that reason, let's say, the chemicals are not included. So one of the things we would like to do is to, let's say, stimulate energy in this renewable energy in the same way as renewable carbons for chemicals, but we don't yet have a European obligation to do that. So for that reason, we don't have an opt-in for that sector. It's only there for the transport sector. Now, but that's a wish. Yes, we would like to do that, and I think also other European countries we also see in a lot of countries there is a strong drive for biorefineries, for the production of biochemicals and the production of biofuels. And at the end, it's always a combined production. It's not a single source, but there are always a lot of different products coming out of these refineries. And biofuels is one of them, but biochemicals is the other one. Now, compared to renewable electricity and also electric vehicles, I think what we see, and that's also what came yesterday very clearly out of our session on biofuels and electrification, is that both need time to be introduced. But biofuels can be introduced much faster than electric vehicles. So in the short term, increasing the blending obligation for renewable biofuels is something you can do easily and where you can realize a lot of greenhouse gas reduction. So and that is also what a lot of other European countries see as well, and that's why biofuels will take off and will be increased also in other European countries. On the other hand, there is a very strong drive for electric vehicles. It is, let's say, for the public, it is easier. It is seen as a clean solution. So it's easier for the public to understand that renewable electricity is clean. You don't have any tailpipe emissions. So there is a strong interest for that, but it will take time before we have, let's say, a lot of electric vehicles on the road. So there is a stimulus. It will happen, but it will really take time. So for that reason, both options are required, both the biofuels and also the electric vehicles. And for certain areas like heavy road transport, biofuels seem to remain, let's say, the solution for the next decades. Yes, and we'll see what happens after that. I hope I answered this question sufficiently.
Oh, yeah, you did. I have just one extra question from myself, but there's more clarification than anything else. And first, let me state that I totally agree, as you know, that biofuels and electric vehicles, in the views of the IEA, are complementary and not necessarily just competing. One thing about the chemicals and the fuels that you mentioned, do you plan to use the same kind of obligation and, let's say, a technology neutral, sector neutral incentive, or do you think to do something a little bit more diversified? I'm asking this also because of the comment of Dr. Wang, noting that the transport sector has, we know it, the most expensive, hard to abate sector. So I'm just curious about the philosophy of your approach.
Mm-hmm. It's under development. We would like to see a certain support in that area, but whether it could be happening through the same system as that we have for the biofuels, that still remains to be seen. It could be nice because it's a very market-oriented approach. You just look for reduction of greenhouse gases, and then biofuels can compete with biochemicals, and then it's up to the market what is the cheapest solution and in what combination they want to do it. So that would be a very nice approach, but it's also very difficult to regulate that because you have to have a very clear picture on how much greenhouse gas savings there are from a biofuels versus a biochemical.
Thank you, Kees. Dr. Esteves, let me come back to the other side of the ocean and let me be a little bit provocative on the other extreme. To some extent, you said it yourself. The price of the RenovaBio certificates were equivalent to $8 to ton of CO2 avoided, if I am not mistaken. And yourself, you said, in principle, we would like the incentive scheme to be able to incentivize new investment in the sector. So, of course, understanding that this is not the only support that Brazil gives to the biofuels, but do you think this is actually enough to drive new investments? And even more so, do you think that this is enough also to drive these other innovative fuels that may come also to Brazil for marine aviation, or a mixture of technologies between first and second generation? So, two questions. Is this instrument in your first evaluation enough to deploy the markets, and to also deploy it maybe beyond the classical sugarcane, ethanol, and biodiesel?
Well, thank you, Paolo, for the question. I would like to say that there's room for improvement. The price difference, when we, as you just noticed, the price difference for the Brazilian CBIOs and in other markets shows that there's room for improvement. But I'd like to point out that Brazil has other policies that combine with RenovaBio. We have the new biofuels policy, or the fuels of the future policy that was just launched, that has a specific eye for innovation and new biofuels, such as hydrogen, aviation fuels, second generation ethanol. So the idea is to keep moving forward with RenovaBio, but adding new policies. The policy is designed to incentivize new fuels. You've asked if I think it's enough. There's no production as of today, for instance, for HVO or other fuels, but it's clear that they can participate, and there's lots of advantages in terms of the efficiency grade that each fuel receives. I believe the idea in Brazil is to combine several policies towards the result, or to look at a way to make those work in a complementary fashion, because the problem is that on the other, we cannot we have to think about the end price for the consumer, and only carbon certificates that end up affecting the final price for the consumer might put a restriction in the overall policy results. So we have to pay attention to that as well. All in all, I believe that the policy it's working fine, not because of the price itself, but because what we are trying to do is to combine it with other policy instruments.
Thank you so much. Very, very clear, and apologies for being a little bit provocative, but this is, I usually do it, and now I will try also to do it with Dr. Brown. Adam, I have two questions. One is coming from the floor and the other from myself. No, two actually. From myself is coming also from the floor, and they are covering two extreme situations. I read the first one. Yesterday in the emerging market session, we heard existing successes and current technologies are difficult to apply to countries that have not started yet to produce biofuels. Can the policy blueprint help to establish industries or to give guidance in the very early stages of implementation? This is number one. On the other opposite extreme, other people plus myself are asking you, how far are we from applying the blueprint to bioproducts and not just to bioenergy? What is the plan here? So thank you for these 2 points.
Okay, thank you, Paolo. On the first issue, I think that the policy blueprint should be helpful to countries who are just entering the biofuels space. I think the policy principles, if you like, that we've suggested give a sort of menu. They say, look, you should really have some policies that deal with each of these 6 issues. And then we will have for each of those, we will have a number of different examples of how countries have addressed that particular area. I think we have to acknowledge that what you can do, the policies you put in place in a very sophisticated market that's already experienced, as in the US or in Brazil, might well be different to those you would do in a country just starting. For example, in a country just starting, you might just straight away have a relatively simple blending mandate. And once that's established and the industry has got going and things, then you could become more sophisticated and move to some sort of low carbon fuel standard or something. But I think the framework that we're identifying, plus the policy examples, will provide a sort of menu from which countries can pick an approach which suits their own preferences, but also where they are in the development of a market for biofuels. So hopefully that will be helpful. The second question is about can we apply this to the wider bioeconomy? That's certainly our objective. I think it's challenging from a number of points of view. First of all, we have to decide exactly what we mean by the bioeconomy. Secondly, we have to see what data we have. It's actually quite difficult to get data on the production of the various bioproducts. And then thirdly, there are actually, to my knowledge, there are relatively few countries that have a comprehensive suite of policies in place so far. Several countries, including, of course, the Netherlands, but the UK, other countries, the EU, have strategies and policies and things in place, but they don't yet. There are actually, as far as I know, there are relatively few countries that have, for example, incentives which encourage production of biochemicals rather than fossil-based chemicals. So we'll have to look a little bit and see what there is out there. I think for now, I imagine that we will be able to come up with some best policy principles, but I don't think we'll have the same library of good practice policy examples that we have for the other sectors. But our aim is, first of all, to apply the approach we've developed so far in heat and power. And I think we can do that. I've had a test of the 6 policy principles. They seem to work quite well in the other sectors. And then we'll try and extend this to the broader bioeconomy. I think it will, hopefully in the next year, we can knock off the other bioenergy options and start to come up with a framework for the wider bioeconomy. But we're moving into a little bit more unknown territory there, so it'll be a bit more speculative, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. I would like to go quickly to the conclusions. I know that Case needs to leave in 3 minutes. So I would like to ask each of you a 30-second statement. If you had to select one single policy priority in your country for bioenergy and bio economy, if you wish, what is it? And I would like to start from you, Case. If you need to go to your minister or to Mr. Timmermans in Brussels at the Commission, and you have only one option of something that you would like to highlight, what is it?
So within the biofuel policy, I would actually call it a bioresources policy, a level playing field for the application of bioresources. That would be my crucial point. Yes, so use the bioresources for chemicals, for fuels, for energy, and value them in a similar way. That would be my main recommendation. And this Biofuture Policy project really was a very good attempt to see what we can learn from each other. And this is not yet finished, so we will have to do much more. But certainly looking into the bioeconomy would be my recommendation to go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Case. This was an excellent point. So who wants to start on the American continent? In the north or in the south? Please raise your hand that I can see you. Who goes first?
Oh, go ahead.
You have
Let's
only
start
one
from
shot.
south.
Okay.
Go,
Dr. Esteves, it's your
let's
turn.
go from south.
You have
Yeah.
only one shot, not more than one.
I'll take my one shot and split in two, a split shot. I would say we have to, in 30 seconds, we have to enhance investments in R&D and innovation through our through R&D policies mechanisms, because we have those as well in Brazil, and also improve the synergies of policies. Brazil has several policies toward decarbonization, efficiency, and I would say, and we are doing that, but I would just point out that that's the most important thing. We have to look at the energy sector as an integrated sector with all the economy and think of integrated solutions. Thank you.
Thanks to you. Now, Dr. Wang, you cannot escape anymore. So,
Okay.
what is your single most important priority?
Yeah, we've seen the bioenergy space and sustainability space in general. Policy has been the key driver so far for our success. So policy are the key. What I would ask is performance-based greenhouse gas reduction goals, and to have all the technologies come in based on greenhouse gas reductions on the life cycle basis or well-to-wheels basis.
Can I ask you one more question, because now I'm intrigued? Differentiated per sector, so technology neutral, but for transport, heat, power, bioeconomy, or all together?
Either way, and your idea for the whole economy, but when we have a whole economy performance-based policies, we know we're going to have some sectors may not make effort as we hoped. So I think sectorial policies will be as important as the economy-wide policies, as sectorial policies should be on performance-based and life cycle basis for technologies to achieve truly greenhouse gas reductions.
Very good. I thank you so much. Extremely clear. Adam, you have the last word. You have the comparison of the countries, and you have looked at also other countries. So if you had to pick one, I know this is a little bit difficult, but if you have to pick one priority to ask the IEA, what would you ask, for instance?
I would say that in the medium to long term, we should be moving towards a complete economy-wide carbon price or carbon tax, which we make it clear is going to go up year after year. That I think would sort out these questions about whether we do biofuels or biochemicals. If emissions from the chemical sector cost a lot, then they would quickly switch to using bioenergy. So I think that would solve these inter-sectoral issues. That's a bit utopic, and I think will take some time to get there. So in terms of practical policies, I think a mandatory blending mandate works. If you say next year you have to put 10% of biofuels into your transport fuels, that just works. People can do it. There's no barriers to it. It's very simple, and that I think is a practical short-term measure. But we need to be moving towards these longer-term signals through carbon prices or carbon taxes, probably.
Okay, I remind you that you and we both live in a country which had the Gilets jaunes, and that a discussion on carbon taxes and carbon prices would need an entire other webinar. So we cannot afford that. I would like to ask all the speakers and the panelists for excellent presentations and discussions. We could have continued this discussion for a while, but we can't. And I would like to close this and to thank you very much. I will try my best tomorrow to summarize your points in the wrap-up session, and I'm sure Renato will challenge me on this. And with that, I really thank everybody. I thank to the listeners and to you again. Thank you so much and have a nice evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you all.